Now, the Russian President Vladimir Putin and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping have held their first face-to-face talks since the start of the Ukraine war. Speaking on the sidelines of a summit in Uzbekistan, Putin thanked China for what he called its balanced position towards Ukraine, and he urged deeper ties with Beijing. President Xi, for his part, said China was willing to work with Russia, describing their partnership as one between great powers.
The last time Chinese President Xi Jinping met Russian President Vladimir Putin in Beijing, he declared there were no limits to the friendship between the two superpowers. That was just days before Russia invaded Ukraine. Since then, Beijing has been largely silent about the Kremlin's war against its neighbor, other than saying that China supports peace talks. Russia and China have also been making their deepening partnership plain to see for the rest of the world by conducting joint military exercises on land, air, and sea. China, for its part, can count on Russia's staying out of what it sees as its domestic affairs, most importantly tensions over Taiwan, which Beijing regards as a breakaway province. Beijing has been stepping up its military activities around the island in response to recent high-profile visits to Taiwan by senior U.S. lawmakers. China continues to play an important indirect role in financing the Kremlin's war machine by supporting Russia's economy with increased energy imports. While Russia has lost markets in the West, trade with China has soared by a third this year. China has said Presidents Xi and Putin are working together to shape what Beijing calls a more just world order.
And for more on this, I'm joined now by our China analyst, Clifford Coonan. Welcome, Clifford. What more can you tell us about this meeting that's just taken place?
Well, now that they've met, we can see the statements are coming thick and fast. And it's very much about communicating an image of two great powers and of these new blocks building up within the world. And what we're seeing here at this meeting, which used to be a fairly sleepy gathering of autocratic nations in Central Asia and in East Asia, is suddenly turning into something with major geopolitical impact. We're seeing Putin is coming out with statements backing China's stance on Taiwan, on self-rule Taiwan, taking aim at the US. Both of them are taking aim at the US, saying it's trying to create a unipolar world. So what we're seeing here is the creation of something quite unusual, I think, and quite new. If maybe New World Order is a bit strong, but it is definitely along those lines of some sort of new pacts building up between these autocratic nations.
Now, this is President Xi's first trip outside China since the pandemic. Why is this summit so important for China?
Well, he needs, first of all, domestically, he needs to be seen to be out there. He needs to be out in the world again. The country is in zero COVID lockdown at the moment in many parts, and he hasn't been out of the country. This is his first foreign visit. So he needs to show that he needs to emphasize China's growing position on the world stage. It's very important. At the same time, he also wants to show that the ties between countries like Russia and other Central Asian countries are very strong. These are important messages for him at home, particularly with the Party Congress coming up in October, at which he's expected to look for leadership for life.
Just a quick question. How balanced is the relationship? You know, does Putin potentially need China more than China needs Russia and Putin?
Well, what was interesting about this, I think there's a lot of statements coming from Russia and very little coming from China, although Chinese tend to be quite reticent. What was interesting was the statements on Taiwan. Given that Russia invaded Ukraine and people are wondering, will China invade Taiwan? Possibly this could be Russia offering its back to China should there be a Taiwanese invasion, or an invasion of Taiwan. So I think it's going to be very significant as we will see how this develops over the next few hours. But there's a lot of interesting developments happening there.
China analyst Clifford Coonan, thanks so much.
China accounts for nearly a fifth of Russia's foreign trade. Trade in energy in particular has grown this year after Russia lost Western buyers due to sanctions over the war in Ukraine. Now, between April and July, China has imported 17% more Russian crude, Imports of liquefied natural gas were up 50%, and imports of electricity rose by 39%. Both countries benefit, China paying lower prices to Russia and Russia replacing some of that revenue lost when Western partners sought alternatives amid sanctions. All right, for more on this, I'm joined by Mikhail Kutikin. He's a partner in the independent Rus Energy Consulting Agency. Mikhail, when we look at trade right now, considering this war, is this a relationship in which both sides, Russia and China, are equals?
No, I do not think so. China receives oil, gas, and coal from Russia and supports Russia exporting machinery, consumer goods, and a lot of other things. And the balance of trade is in favor of Russia if we focus on the price of energy commodities. But technically speaking, Russia depends on China much more than China depends on Russia.
To what extent can Russia replace energy trade with Europe through trade with China? This has been the big question now since the war began.
It is not possible to increase crude oil deliveries to China because of transportation limitations. The pipeline that goes to China cannot handle more than 1.3 million barrels per day. And basically, this is the limit. In terms of gas supply, China do not need an increase of gas supply from Russia because right now there is just one pipeline that goes from eastern Siberia across the border to China. It is going to reach its nameplate capacity of 38 billion cubic meters a year in 2025 only. There are no other ways to increase gas deliveries from Russia to China.
How badly are sanctions hitting Russia's ability to maintain and build out its energy sector? It has, of course, ambitions to build out more connections with China, as you just mentioned, with some pipelines, for example.
Yes, we are expecting a meeting between the leaders of China, Russia, and Mongolia in Samarkand today. And I think they are going to discuss a new pipeline, which Mr. Putin suggested a while ago. It is called the Power of Siberia 2, and it is to carry 50 billion cubic meters of Russian gas a year across the border to Mongolia and then across Mongolia to China. There are two problems. First, China has always rejected the idea of having a transit country on its way to import energy. And second, it will take about 12 to 15 years to build a pipeline of that capacity from the Yamal Peninsula to China.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Energy analyst Mikhail Kutikin, thank you very much.
Let's get some context on this from Reed Standish. He's a journalist for Radio Free Europe and covers China and its influence in the Eurasia region. Reed, there's lots to unpack here. Let's just start with the ties between China and Russia first. Are we looking at both countries reaffirming their no-limits partnership agreed to back in February?
Absolutely. I think that a big part of this visit is about reaffirming the ties between Beijing and Moscow. That's certainly the message that Xi and Putin are hoping to send to the world and especially to the West. But as much as there's this discussion about a no-limits partnership, I think we've also learned in the last 7 months of war that there is actually some limits. So as much as China has, stood by Russia throughout the war and provided some diplomatic support and also, bought up things like, cheap Russian energy that's been put onto the market and supporting the Russian economy that way, China has also been very cautious not to explicitly endorse the invasion of Ukraine and also has just generally tried to walk away from some of these finer points and to avoid secondary sanctions on its own economy. So I think we're going to see Xi straddling a line still. But still, the message that they want to send is that Beijing and Moscow, their ties have not been broken, even if on closer scrutiny they might be strained.
And I wonder if we see a demonstration of this at the SCO meeting itself. I mean, the reason I ask is because we heard Secretary General Zhang Ming saying that the SCO represents a new type of international relations. The Kremlin has talked of an alternative to Western-centric organizations. Are we therefore seeing the beginnings of a new counter to the Western global order?
Well, that's certainly the main force and kind of the glue that sticks Beijing and Moscow together is this idea of trying to create an alternative to the Western-led order that most people would be familiar with. Whether that can succeed, I think, is really the question that's at hand here. This is clearly the fact that Xi has chosen the SCO as the first. As part of his first trip abroad since January 2020, obviously shows what a big deal it is to Beijing, and especially him as an individual and as a leader. And so I think that the line that's going to be difficult for Xi and for Putin is, how they can deal with this shadow that's been cast by the Ukraine war over this broader goal of trying to show this alternative world order, because the fallout from the war has hurt Eurasia quite significantly, and especially if we look at the Central Asian countries,
right.
Their economies, which have been quite tied to Russia generally, have taken a big hit. They've also watched this Russian revanchism and nationalism that's rising in the treatment of Ukraine, and that's also sparked anxieties and fears that perhaps they could be next. That's been particularly the case for Kazakhstan, and it's actually seen some interesting diplomatic episodes between the Russians and the Kazakhs. So it's going to be difficult for Beijing to unite everyone under one banner, which is generally, I think, a difficulty of the SCO, as much as maybe there might be some kind of unity around this idea of pushing back against a Western-led order. There's a lot of rivalries and divisions between themselves.
Let's just talk about the Central Asian countries. I mean, you brought it up. Traditionally, they were closer to Russia than they were to China. But then the fallout of the Ukraine war, are they looking at perhaps something coming from China their way? Do they want to be closer to China as a buffer against Russia? Is that what they're looking for?
I think definitely. I mean, if you're a Central Asian state right now, and Russia has worried you, its actions in Ukraine, both the invasion and then also just looking long-term at the state of its economy, they're obviously looking for alternatives. The European Union, the United States have been distancing themselves from that part of the world for quite some time. We have seen some diplomatic outreach to the Middle East and especially to Turkey from Central Asia in the last 6 months. But I think China is really the big ticket. It's the world's second largest economy. It's already been building up its economic and political ties in Central Asia for decades. And China is signaling that it wants to continue to deepen and grow that relationship. And that's a big part about what this visit is all about, actually. But it's going to be tough for Beijing to straddle this line again between how do we show that we are in this, quote unquote, no limits partnership with the Russians, and at the same time show the Central Asians that we can look after their interests and protect their sovereignty, which perhaps in some Central Asian capitals' points of views might be kind of contradictory points at this stage.
Briefly, Reid, is this an opportunity for China to increase its influence in Central Asia?
Without a doubt. I would say even before this summit, China had been doing so, and this is in effect, just gasoline on a fire that's been burning quite strongly for a long time. We see there's a lot of interest across the region to bring in Chinese investment and to try and deepen those ties. And I think China is going to have more than its fair share of opportunities to do so.
We'll leave it there for the time being. Always a pleasure talking to you, Reid Standish from Radio Free Europe. Thanks so much.
Thank you.